have a source sheet for tonight, and I'm going to put a link to it into the chat. So it's a PDF document you can look at. I'm going to do the screen share, and you can just look at the PDF later, or if you've got enough screen, you can look at it or print it out or whatever you like. Okay. So here is the screen share, or rather the source sheet. And I'll give you a link to last week's source sheet too. Actually, we didn't get through everything last week, so there's some overlap between what was on the last week's sheet and what's on this one.
David, did you say there would be a separate source sheet you'll send as well, or?
Yeah, I just put it up.
Gotcha.
And I forgot to send in this morning's reminder, but I sent in the recording announcement last time where these things will be on our website.
Yeah, okay, so you're going to put these up on the website too. Yeah, this is just my Google Drive.
It'll be useful.
Sorry, I think the link you sent was the same link.
The same link? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
My bad. Let me do it again. Copy.
Did that mean we got last week's twice or this week's twice in the chat links?
The ones that are in the chat are the same thing, and they're this week's.
This week.
Okay, all right, thanks.
And there's last week's.
Got it.
Well, should we get started? Wait another minute, Cherry? Whatever you like.
Yeah, I'm also confused. The link you sent in first is last week's?
Yeah, no, the link I sent first is the current, the one we're going to use tonight.
It has today's date on, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Then I'm also copying it.
So here's what I'd like to do. Since it's a nice, cozy group, I would love to invite anybody who is got their camera on mute to unmute so we can see each other. No one has to, of course, but if you are willing, we can sort of pretend that we're sitting around a room and talking about these texts. It'll be more fun and more interesting if I'm not the only one talking. So, love to have you guys show yourselves, and I'll invite comments too as we go along. Try to be a little bit more interactive. I guess we're often interactive, but we'll do a little bit more tonight. So if it's no problem, Sarah, I just ate mine, so I understand. I'm going to put up the source sheet on the screen share, and if you don't want to see it, host disabled participants.
Yeah, I forgot to make you a host. Co-host. I'll do that now. Trying to.
Okay.
Okay.
Whoops.
Yes. Okay, I've done it now. Sorry about that.
No problem. Okay, so here we go. Share screen. Again, anybody who would like to unmute their camera, I invite you to do that. So here's the screen to share. I hope it's visible. Do I need to make it larger or smaller?
It's fine. I think it's good.
Okay, great. So we're going to pick up with where we left off, and there is going to be some repetition from last week, partly because Mishna means repetition. So you're not going to learn something just reading through it once or hearing it once. So we'll go through a couple of these more than once, and most of it will be new. But we're going to start with the basic problem here, which is the tension between saying the prescribed regular thing, what's printed in the book, versus expressing ourselves from our hearts. And the problem is we're talking to God, and that's hard. And I'm not a poet, I'm not a liturgical genius, and it's hard to sort of decide what you want to say to God. And so there's a tension between what's called keva, which is the fixed or standardized prayer book, and what's called kavanah, which means intention or focus or thinking hard about what it is that you're reading and understanding it and turning that into your own ideas about what to say. So,
David, can I interrupt 1 minute? The transcript and closed captions is on, so if anybody wants to look at the transcript while David is talking, you can do that. Sorry.
you can, but we don't encourage it. Maybe we do. Anyway, so we looked at this last week, but we're going to expand on it this week. So Rabbi Shimon said, be careful, meaning be careful about following the rules, saying it at the right time, with the Kriyat Shema and with the Tefillah. Tefillah, in modern Hebrew, we use that word just to mean prayer generically, but in the Mishnah, it specifically means Amidah, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. So when you pray, mitpalel, which means pray the Amidah, al tas tfilatcha keva. Don't make your prayer keva. Ela rachamim v'tachanunim lifnei hamakom baruch hu. Make it a plea for mercy and petitions and asking God for mercy and compassion. And then there's this proof text from the prophet Joel. And don't consider yourself wicked in your own eyes. So this is a basic proof text that says keva isn't really what it's about. It's really about kavanah. And we're going to come back to some of the counter arguments. But this is from Pirkei Avot, which is actually part of the Mishnah. We're used to thinking of it as a standalone source, but it is one of the parts of the Mishnah. So now we're going to jump forward into the Talmud. And as I explained last week, the Talmud really includes the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Mishnah is in Hebrew, and it's relatively easy to understand. It's in pretty simple Hebrew or very short, very brief. The Gemara is in Aramaic, and it's much more complicated and intricate. And if we get time, we'll look at a bit of Gemara towards the end of this class. So the Mishnah says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Kol ha'oseh tfilato keva. Okay, we're basically quoting this section from Avot, which also appears in Berachot, in the Mishnah that we're working on. So what is keva? Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi said that Rabbi Yoshaya said Now, again, we're very careful about attributing our sources. This is out of respect for Rabbi Yoshaya. Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi is not going to claim that he came up with this himself. He's going to provide the source, and that's a matter of respect. That is still an issue today. He said it means your prayer feels like a burden. Oh, do I have to go through this again? So boring. What the heck? The sages say it means one who does not pray in the language of supplication. So that's, it's similar. The idea is that it's, there's no energy in it. There's no mindfulness in it. You're just sort of running through it. A little bit different from the first opinion, but pretty similar. And let me just point out that in the Gemara, in the text here, it calls them Rabbanan. Rabbanan Amre, Kol Mi She'eino Omra B'Lishon Tachanimim. So Rabbanan means the sages, and that's the Aramaic, and in Hebrew it's Chachamim, the wise ones, and that's sort of the anonymous majority. And usually when there's a debate between one rabbi and the Rabbanan or the Chachamim, if you need to know what the right answer is, it's usually the majority, because the majority rules, even in these olden days. Here, I guess, we don't really need to have an answer of which is the right answer, but a lot of times we do. So here's another opinion, Rabba v'Rav Yosef, the Amrei Tarvaihu. Both of these two rabbis say it means somebody who's unable to introduce a novel element. And this is an interpretation. Now, I'm violating my own rule. I don't remember where I got this interpretation, but it means something personal to the prayer. You know something? I got this from Sepharia. It's from the translation in Sepharia and the interpretation, which is a fantastic website that I can tell you about later. Something personal, reflecting your personal needs. And I don't know about you, maybe I can stop in a second and see if anyone has any reactions. When I go through the prayer book, I try to read the paragraphs of the book to the extent that I understand what the heck it is that it's saying. I try to think about something that I care about, that I'm, worried about. So there's a prayer for healing, and I think about people I know who are ill, not just in the Shabbat prayers when you have the congregational prayer for the sick, but even in the weekdays, there's a part of the Amidah that says this. Or when it says there's a prayer for sustenance or for good harvests, and I think about, wouldn't it be wonderful if the economy could come back, So, or the prayer for justice, I used to pray that one very intently during the Trump administration. Maybe I'm still praying it because we all need a little more justice. The point is that it's not just a book, you're putting something into it, you're putting your mind into it, and you're addressing God in a way. So that's these two rabbis are really focusing on the kavanah element, the idea of intentionality and of, it's not just the words on the page, it's introducing something new, it's a novel element. Rabbi Zeba comes back and says, well, I wish I could do that. I actually can do it, but when I do, I lose my place. I get confused. So this is another argument that's pulling us back to the standardized text. Yeah, all this creativity, all this sort of ideas are wonderful, but I'm just going to get lost if I stray too far into that. I want to stop and see if anyone has any comments or thoughts or questions or ideas about that. Yeah, Sarah, please.
So this seems to be like a tension that runs throughout all of our lives in every aspect of it. I'm at once reminded of the lofty work by Martin Buber, I versus Thou, which is, you can't have an I-thou relationship with everything, otherwise you'll get burned out. And I'm also reminded of when my oldest child was 3, we lived in New York City at the time, and I would walk him home from nursery school. And at the time he was very much into, I don't know, some characters, and he would make up these stories on the way home. And I mean, there was like 2.5 foot difference in our ears, right? My mouth his mouth to my ears, and we're on Broadway walking up the Upper West Side. I couldn't hear everything he would say. And he would stop and he'd say, like, what did I just say? And if I couldn't repeat it, he'd have like a meltdown right there on Broadway. It's just impossible to like have kavanah all the time. By the way, he's completely well adjusted. He's getting married in 2 months. He's fine.
Mazel tov. Any other thoughts? Anyone want to jump in?
Let's see. I guess I'll just say that I think it's an important topic. I guess that's why I signed up for this class. I don't know if you addressed this in the first class, as I missed it, but I suppose one should be to meta speak would be: is there a function for the topic altogether that you want to that you've already addressed in terms of the function for this particular study that you had in mind when you offered it? But I mean, I think that basically, and the question of how you do it can be important, but that you cipher this distinction is an important point. So that's all I'll say for now, I think.
Sure, thanks. Well, maybe we'll enlighten that as we go along, hopefully. I guess the one other thing that I'd add is these two are not necessarily in conflict. They might reinforce each other. So it might be easier to get to that place of kavanah if you have a fixed book to go through. And some of the sources we'll look at actually support both the importance of keva and the importance of kavanah. But this is keva just in the sense of a fixed liturgy, not in the sense of burdensome or rote or meaningless. We're looking for the good version of keva. So here's the case for keva, a couple of them. I'm thinking about the concept in American law of the time, place, and manner, right? Restricting free speech. How much can you restrict it? Well, it depends on the time, the place, and the manner. And a lot of times it's the wrong time and the wrong place. So we looked at these texts last week, but just to go through them real quickly, there are rules about what time we say these different things. And if you don't say it at the right time, you haven't fulfilled your obligation, because from the point of view of the teachers who wrote these texts, and from the point of view of a lot of people today, it's not just a good idea or fun or pleasing to do this, which hopefully it is. It's also an obligation. It's a commandment. So how do you discharge your obligation? So the first one is the first Mishnah in the Berachot. From what time does one recite the Shema? From the time when the priests go in to eat until the end of the first watch, and then what's the end point? So there's a beginning and an end that is the right time, and that is keva. That says you don't just say it whenever you want to. In the evening, you say it at a certain time, and in the morning, you say it in a certain time. We read this one last week too. Me'ematai korin shema be'aravit, b'shacharit. What time do we read it? In the morning. And here's the difference between the time you can distinguish blue and white versus blue and green. Obviously, the sun has to have come up a little bit more to get to the blue and green. And there's a beginning point and there's an end point. And there are teachings that relate to this. These are about the Shema. And one interesting thing that we talked a little about last week is that the first one, Mishnah 1.1, sets the times for both the beginning point and the end point with reference to things that used to happen in the ancient temple. The temple was destroyed in the year 70 CE, and the guys who are writing this are operating somewhere between 70 and 200 CE. So it's very fresh, very painful. And if your frame of reference is that the way to get close to God is through the rituals in temple, the sacrifices and so on, and these tefillot come along, these prayers and these rituals are in a way a replacement for what went on in the temple. So that's an interesting way to begin here in Berachot. So there is a right time, and this is true not only for the Shema, but also for the Amidah. And here's a source we didn't look at last week. Tfilat HaShachar ad Chatzot, the morning tefillah until noon, but Rabbi Yehuda says until 4 hours. And just to explain Talmudic time, they would take a day from sunrise to sunset and divide that into 12 equal parts. So if sunrise is at 6 a.m. and sunset is at 6 p.m., the fourth hour would be 10 o'clock, right? But the hours might be a lot shorter in the winter time and a lot longer in the summertime because it's just a division in equal twelfths of the time of day. Here the Shema we read until the third hour, but the Tefillah we read until the fourth hour. So there's a little bit of, you get a little extra time for this part. Was there a question? That's fine, we'll go in. So there is a time for the morning tefillah. There's a time for the afternoon tefillah. And here's a difference between the anonymous voice, who's usually the majority voice, but not always. The afternoon tefillah until evening, and Rabbi Yehuda says until the middle of the afternoon, and then the evening time, ein la keva. Tfilat ha'erev ein la keva. Keva means fixed. There's no right answer. It means sometime at night. V'shel musafin kol hayom. Rabbi Yehuda omer ad shava shaot. So here again, there's a difference. And just to quiz you on your math and on your understanding of Talmudic time, what time is the seventh hour in a day of 6 a.m. to 6 p.m.? Quick.
3 p.m.
Yeah, Carol. Oh, you're on mute.
The seventh hour would be 1 p.m.
Excellent. All right. So
100-hour military time.
Yeah, just to make sure we're all paying attention. Difficult to do, especially this time of day. So let me. So there's the time, the place, and the manner. So the manner is, you don't make this up. If this is now talking about the Shema again, in the morning you say 2 before and 1 after, in the evening 2 before and 2 after. A long one and a short one. We're not giving a lot. And by the way, these rules still apply. And if you open up any prayer book, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, they're all going to follow this. This is a pattern that goes back 2,000 years. And so there's a real risk about taking things out and adding things in about what are we doing? We're straying from this very ancient practice that is pretty uniform among most strands of Judaism. Makom she'amru laharich eino rashai lekatzer eino rashai laharich. If it's supposed to be a long one, you shouldn't say a short one. And if it's supposed to be a short one, you shouldn't say a long one. What is a short one and a long one? It means there are some blessings that just have one Baruch atah Adonai. For example, Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, right? Only one, that's a short one. A long one would be something like the first blessing before the Shema. It starts Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bidvaro ma'ariv aravim. I don't know if this is familiar to folks, but you can look it up in your prayer book. And then at the end, it says Baruch atah Adonai ma'ariv aravim. So there's a Baruch at the beginning and a Baruch at the end. That's a long one. But then the next one, there's no Baruch at the beginning, only at the end, so that's a short one. And interesting, it says it depends on the place. In some places it's long, in some places it's short. You know, maybe in Ashkenazi tradition it's one thing, and in Sephardi tradition it's something else. But follow the sages in whatever place you are. Okay, so there's a time and there's a manner, these are all, again, rules that are fixed, that are not just what you're saying and how you're thinking about it, but just what are you doing? Practical brass tacks. Hakorei Shema v'lo hishmiya la'ozno. If he was reading the Shema and didn't make it heard in his own ear. Rabbi Yossi Omer lo yatsa, but the majority says yatsa. He's fulfilled or he hasn't fulfilled. And actually here Rabbi Yossi is the law follows Rabbi Yossi. No, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. It follows the majority. You don't have to make it heard by your own ear, but it's kind of nice if you do. If you recite it without carefully pronouncing the consonants, is that okay or is that not okay? Okay, so again, here's the difference between these two rabbis, and without getting into the details, I'm bringing these examples just to show you that the details do matter. This one we'll get into a little bit more. One who recites it out of order has not fulfilled his obligation.
Question?
But what does it mean to be out of order? According to Rabbi Kulp, whose translations and interpretations are fantastic and they're online, if you recite the verses within a paragraph out of order, then you've really scrambled it up, and that's not good. But if you recite the third paragraph before the second one, not as much of a problem. But I think some people would probably disagree. And if you recite it and make a mistake, you go back to where you made the mistake. Okay, we understand that people make mistakes, they get distracted, but fix it. It's not okay to just sort of say, well, whatever. You really ought to go back and correct it, because this is an obligation. And again here, the same with what we've been reading up here is about the Shema, and here's about the Amidah. The Musaf prayer is said only with the local congregation, but the sages, and here we're in Hebrew, we're in Mishna, so it's Chachamim. In Aramaic, it would be Rabbanan. The Chachamim say, you can say it with the congregation or without the congregation. And then Rabbi Yehuda has a different spin on it. And the answer here is that the sages are right. You're supposed to say it with or without the congregation, which is kind of a shock for those of us who belong to synagogues that don't say Musaf ever. So I'm contradicting what I said before. Here's the last one. Just it's actually in this whole section, and it leads into discussion of what do you do when you have a seminal emission. You're not supposed to do things that are holy until you've had the chance to go to a mikvah. So the mikvah is not just for women, it's for men. And what do you do? Well, this one says, these blessings before and after, you shouldn't say, because those were, after all, added by the rabbis. They're old, but they don't go all the way back to the Bible. They were added by the rabbis, whereas the Shema itself is an obligation from the Torah, essentially from Mount Sinai, from the Word of God. So there, just say it in your heart. And by the way, here, saying it in your heart sounds a little bit kavanah-like. So we're not just talking about the keva, but there's a rule even about something as personal as what do you do when you're in that situation. Okay, I want to take a little detour and just explain the difference between the Shema and the Amidah, because I don't want to assume that everyone knows what this is. So the Shema consists of 3 paragraphs, the Shema Yisrael, the Hayayim Shemoah, and Vayomer. And again, if you have a prayer book somewhere around, look it up, because it's really, this is real basic stuff and it's good to know. And as we read before, it's said twice a day, morning and evening. Why? Because the text itself says when you lie down and when you rise up. So we learned from Hillel way back when that means when you lie down, at the time when you lie down and the time you rise up, twice a day. And in the morning, there's 2 before and 1 after. And in the evening, there's 2 before and 2 after. So this comes right from the Bible, so it's a very core rule that you have to say the Shema twice a day. From the point of view of the rabbis who wrote this, this is what God is telling us to do. And then the Amidah, Amidah means the standing prayer, but it's also called tefillah, as I said before. Tefillah just means prayer, but there's a distinction that Shema is really just reading or reciting. There's no flexibility at all. You're really just reading the words of those 3 biblical paragraphs. With the Amidah, there's a little bit more expectation of not just reading the paragraphs, but of pouring out your heart to God, essentially. And on the weekdays, well, it's said 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. We mentioned Musaf. Musaf is an additional one that is inserted on Shabbat and holidays and Rosh Chodesh and other special times. And on weekdays, it consists of 19 blessing paragraphs, 3 at the beginning, 13 in the middle, and 3 at the end, except that we're going to read in this Mishnah. I don't know if I actually quoted this. The Mishnah says, wait, we call it the Shemona Esrei, the 18, but they're actually 19. What is that about? So even at the time of the Mishnah, they had 19 blessings, which we still have 19 blessings, but they called it the Shemona Esrei, which is the 18, and it's still called that by a lot of people. And usually in the afternoon, there's no Shema, just the Amidah, but in the morning and in the evening, we have both. So usually we recite the 2 blessing paragraphs, the 3 paragraphs of the Shema, and then whatever comes afterward, that comes first, and then the Amidah follows right after that. So just to go back to where we were, but I wanted to make sure that that's laid out because I don't want to assume that everyone has this background. So the Shema is a recitation. The Amidah is more of a prayer. It's an expression, a little bit, but they both have rules, and you have to follow the rules for both of them. So now we're going to look at the case for kavanah, which is intention, mindfulness. The Shema comes from the Torah. So, what if you're just reading the Torah and you go along and you're in Deuteronomy and all of a sudden you're chapter 6 and verse 4, and there it is, Shema Yisrael, Adonai, and you go through it, and it just so happens to be, that special time when you're supposed to be saying it. Is that enough? Just you happen to be reading and you read those words. And the answer is, if you have kavanah, then yes, you've fulfilled your obligation. If you're just reading a book, no. So then the question is, what does kavanah mean here? Does it mean just the intention to satisfy the mitzvah, or does it mean something more, like trying to read, trying to put meaning into what you're saying, and what does it mean to say, love the Lord your God, and all of those ideas? Or is it something very basic, like just reading the words correctly and saying Shema Yisrael and not some other thing? So different ideas of what kavanah means, but it's something going on in your mind that goes above and beyond just reading the words on the page. Okay, now we're going to get to some quotes that tell you that you not only have to read them, you have to focus on them. So here is the Shema again. And even though it's just a recitation or a reading, we're told here that it's really important to focus. In the breaks between sections, which means between the paragraph, you can give a greeting out of respect and return greeting. In the middle of a section, which means right in the middle of a paragraph, you're in between the word ve'ahavta, and then the next word is et Adonai Elohecha. You don't want to get distracted and get messed up with that, but you can give a greeting out of fear. According to Rabbi Meir, a greeting out of fear would be something like you're praying by the side of the road and along comes Emperor Vespasian, and if you don't stop and say something respectful, your head is going to get chopped off. Respect might mean you're in the shul and some person who deserves to be respected comes along and shakes your hand, you might not extend your hand, but if somebody extends their hand to you, it's respectful to shake the hand, or maybe nowadays use your elbow, but that would be a greeting out of respect. So there's a difference of opinion between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda about how far you go to keep your focus on the words and not be distracted. And just reading these, who's stricter? Who is telling you that it's more important to keep your focus on no matter what? Try not to be interrupted unless you absolutely have to be. Who's being tougher here?
Rabbi Meir.
And why?
Because he says only in the, in between paragraphs. And Rabbi Yehuda says you can do it, well, I don't know, maybe Rabbi Yehuda says not between paragraphs. I take that back. Rabbi Yehuda is maybe saying not in the middle of paragraphs, in between paragraphs, but only in situations of fear.
Yeah, I think Rabbi Yehuda is a little bit more liberal. He's saying that if someone says hello to you, you can say shalom back to anyone. Meshiv shalom l'chol adam. In the breaks, you can say hello to somebody out of respect. In Rabbi Meir's view, if someone says hello to you, you don't want to be so rude as to not say hello back, but you might not initiate it. But in Rabbi Yehuda's view, it's okay to initiate it, to reach out your hand, not just to respond that way. And of course, everybody says, if you're in danger of having your head cut off, just don't be stupid, right? So, but here when it comes to the Amidah, afilu hamelech shoel bishlomo, even if the king greets him and says, how are you doing? Shalom aleichem, he should not respond, even if a snake is wrapped around his heel. He shouldn't stop, he shouldn't interrupt. So whoever wrote this Mishnah is taking a much more serious view about keeping that focus on the Amidah, because the Amidah is all about talking to God, whereas Shema, you're reading a paragraph, and it's important to keep your focus on, but here it's absolutely life and death. By the way, this is not the rule. Don't try this at home. But it shows you just how seriously they take this obligation to say the Amidah. Most of the rest of these sources, though, are going to be treating both the Shema and the Amidah similarly as requiring a lot of focus and concentration. So I talked before about the time and the manner. So the expression in American law is time, place, and manner. So here's one about the place. And again, this distinguishes between the two versions. Ha'umanim korin berosh ha'ilan, o berosh ha'nidbach, ma she'einan reshayim la'asot ken tefillah. The workers can recite the Shema, they use the word korin, on top of a tree or on top of scaffolding, but they're not allowed to do that in the case of the tefillah. There's another reason, in addition to the fact that you really want to keep your focus on, and it's a bad idea to be focusing on a prayer when you're up in a tree. Kind of better to wait and come down and then put your focus on that. But also because the tefillah, the Amidah, you're supposed to be standing, whereas with the Shema, we talked last week about two different opinions, and there was one opinion, which is the house of Shammai, that said it matters whether you're standing or sitting. And the other opinion, the house of Hillel, which everyone's been following for the last 2,500 years, is it doesn't matter. You can say it's sitting or standing. But that's the Shema. With the Amidah, you have to be standing, and maybe that's not so practical if you're on a tree. You might have to sit on whatever the thing is that you're sitting. But it's also about keeping your focus. I'm going to jump down one to number 4.4. If you're traveling in a dangerous place, you say a short prayer. So we still want to keep that focus on, but we are loosening up a little bit and saying, well, yeah, but if you're in a dangerous place, be careful. Being careful is also important. I guess the one before it, Rabban Gamliel says, every day you should pray the full 18 blessings. Rabbi Yehoshua says the abbreviated 18, and Rabbi Akiva has a middle position which says, if you are good at this, remember that people don't have prayer books in those days. So a lot of people are saying this from memory. If you can do this from memory, you should do the whole thing. And if not, the abbreviated version is good enough. So he's striking a middle position. It's important to have that keva to follow the full 18 to do every one of them. But if that's not going to work for you, say the abbreviated 18. Rabbi Yehoshua is very liberal here, says it doesn't matter, say the abbreviated 18. Rabban Gamliel is being super strict and saying everybody has to say the whole thing. And Rabbi Akiva has a middle position here. Yes, please.
What is the abbreviated 18?
Yeah, good question. And this again, if you look in a modern prayer book, you're going to see the abbreviated 18. And the abbreviated 18, I'll scroll up here to this. The 3 introductory paragraphs and the 3 concluding paragraphs are identical to the full 18. But the 13 petitionary paragraphs are condensed down to basically to a single paragraph that captures all 13 ideas in a single paragraph. So that's the abbreviated version. The 3 at the beginning and the 3 at the end are the same, but the middle part is condensed. It's the Reader's Digest version. And it's okay, especially if you don't know the full thing. But if you've got a prayer book sitting in front of you, then it shouldn't be that hard to read it if you can read Hebrew. If you can't, that's a question that we'll get back to. So here's one that's comparable to the one about the tree. And we're now talking about the Amidah, not the Shema. If you are riding on a donkey, you should dismount to pray. If you're unable to dismount, turn your face towards Jerusalem to pray. And if that's not practical, direct your mind towards the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy of Holies. And in Hebrew, Eino yachol lachzir et panav, if he's not able to turn his face, yechavein et libo keneged Beit Kodashim. And this word yechavein, the kaf, vav, nun is the same root as kavanah. So I'm bringing this here as an example of you really should get off that donkey, and if it's not practical, that kavanah is still possible, and you should still go for that. Again, we're talking about the Amidah here. If the snake is wrapped around your heel, don't move. If you're on the donkey and the time comes to say the Amidah, you should say it safely, but the kavanah is critical. The same thing if you're on a ship or on a wagon or a raft. You probably can't dismount if you're on a raft in the water or a ship. And in any case, you might not even know which direction to turn your face, towards the east, if you're not good at navigating. So here, your only choice is to direct your mind, and that's what you have to do. So finally, there is this interesting one. Ein omdim lehitpalel ela mitoch koved rosh. One may stand and begin to pray only in koved rosh, means literally like a heavy head, a reverent ace. Take this seriously. Don't just sort of jump into it. And this group of the pious men of the past but in Hebrew it's Hasidim Harishonim. It's the same word as like Hasidim that you think of today as being followers of these charismatic rabbis who wear special Eastern European outfits. But this word Hasid really just means pious. And there was some group back in the olden days that were the Hasidim Harishonim who went over and above the basic obligation. And they used to wait a full hour before praying the Amidah. And Dawn, this one's for you. They did the Psukei de Zimra. This is where Psukei de Zimra comes from, which is the introductory part of the morning service. And that's why we have it, because you don't just jump in. It doesn't work very well. You want to be prepared for it. And again, this is an example of the kavanah being the most important thing. And then yet you bumped up against this number 4.4. Rabbi Yehoshua says, if you're in a dangerous place, just do the short prayer. Or even if you don't know the full thing, do the short prayer. Do you guys see this as a conflict or a tension, or is this easy to reconcile? Interested in your views on this.
It's very strict starting, but then it becomes practical under certain circumstances, right? Like the rules are very, very strict, but it's practical. If you can't do it this way, at least do it this way, and you can still get to do it, and you can still fulfill the mitzvah that you have to do. So it seems to go from the strict to the practical, in my mind.
Yeah, that's a good point. And even if you get mixed up as you're going along, it's okay. Go back to where you got messed up and start again. So yeah, I think they're trying to accommodate both, and that really they don't bump each other. At least they don't bump too hard into each other. Maybe a little bit. Here's a couple of.
I'm not sure if you can see that Sarah has her hand up.
I'm sorry, Sarah, please. Thank you, Dawn.
I know my hand color doesn't contrast with my background very well. Thank you. I just wanted to say that somewhere in Deuteronomy, close to where the Shema is said, it says, "These rules you shall live by." And the rabbis have interpreted that to mean that nothing in Judaism should put you in a position where you would lose your life, because these are rules meant to live by, not to die by.
Yeah, great point. And you really have to wonder about the thing about the snake wrapped around your heel. I would like to learn more about why they said that. It's obviously hyperbole.
And how would you maintain focus? If you had a snake wrapped around your leg, how are you supposed to keep your focus and, not be distracted by a snake around your leg? That's how I felt about that one.
Perfect point. Perfect point. Actually, that's a great segue into this next page. So I put a little title here. I have two case studies, and this one is my kavanah more important than yours. Okay. Remember last week we talked about Rabban Gamliel, who was the head of the Sanhedrin, and he also was a hereditary leader. He descended directly from the line of Hillel himself. So Rabban Gamliel was rich and important and powerful, and he was in the first or second generation after the destruction of the temple. So we hear a lot about him. And here's a couple more stories. Last week we had a story about his sons who came home late from a party, and they said, what do? We never got around to reciting the evening Shema, and there's a source that told us that we're supposed to get it done by midnight, and here it is much later, we still haven't done it. And Rabban Gamliel says, if the sun hasn't come up yet, you still have to do it. So maybe he's stricter, maybe he's also more lenient, which is to say, you haven't missed your chance just because it's past midnight, because even past midnight, it's okay, go ahead and fulfill your obligation by saying. But in any case, he's a big one for doing all the keva that you can. Kavanah, maybe, we'll see. So the general rule, a bridegroom is exempt from reciting the Shema on the first night after the wedding until the end of Shabbat. And I think what we're talking about here is there's a celebration that goes on for 7 days. You might get married on a Sunday, and then you have 7 days of celebrations, and then at the end of Shabbat, you're back in your regular life. If he hasn't done the deed, and in Hebrew, imlo asa ma'aseh, which really literally means if he hasn't done the deed. So we've got the seminal emissions, and now we have doing the deed after the wedding day. Don't think that this is not practical about real people and their real lives, because it is. So why do we have a rule like this? It seems kind of obvious. If you are a newlywed, you're number one, you're supposed to be focusing on your new married life and your spouse, but also how are you going to focus on these words in the prayer book if you are distracted by all this excitement of having just been married? And so this is about kavanah, which says basically, if you can't do this at all because you're just totally focused on something else and properly totally focused on something else, you're off the hook. Don't do it. And literally it says he's exempt from reciting the Shema. But then the question is, does exempt mean he should not do it? Or does it mean just he's not required to, but he can if he wants to? So Rabban Gamliel, this is a maaseh, a happening. If you're a lawyer, you would say this is not black letter law from a statute. This is case law. This is something that actually happened, and we're going to learn from this story about what the rule should be. So maaseh Rabban Gamliel. One time, Rabban Gamliel recited the Shema on the first night after he'd married. And Amru lo Talmidah, his students said to him, "But Rabbi, didn't you teach us that a chatan, a bridegroom, is exempt from saying Kriyat Shema on that first night?" Now they're reading this, and I think he's also reading it to mean exempt doesn't just mean you don't need to, but you can if you want to. They're reading this to say you shouldn't do it. Don't go there. Focus on your lovely new wife, and when you're at a point where you can pay more attention, that's when you get back to focusing on God. So Rabban Gamliel says to them, "Eini shomea lachem levatel mimeni malchut shamayim afilu sha'a echad." I'm not going to listen to you to remove my commitment to God, to the sovereignty of the one on high, for even a single moment. So Rabban Gamliel, this is why I titled, "Is my covenant more important than yours, or is mine better than yours?" We have this kind of liberal, permissive rule for the ordinary hoi polloi. And Rabban Gamliel says, but you're not going to tell me to do this, because for me, I can focus on my new wife and pay attention to God, and I'm not going to let go of God for a single moment. So from a wedding to a funeral, now we're talking about mourning. Rachatz, he washed. Laila Harishon Shemeta Ishto, the first night after his wife died. Amru lo Talmidav, his students said to him, Lo Imanatanu Rabbeinu, didn't you teach us, Rabbi, She'avel Asur Lirchotz, that a mourner is forbidden to wash? Okay, so we're changing the subject a little bit, but there's a connection, as you can see. And this often happens in the Mishnah and even more in the Talmud. While we're on the topic of this is kind of similar to this other story over here. So here's another mitzvah. It's not about prayer at all. It's about ritual washing. And he goes and does it, and the students say, wait a second. The rule is that you're not supposed to. And he says, I'm special. Eini kachar kol adam, istanis ani. I'm not like all the other people. I'm very delicate. Istanis sounds like a Greek word. It'd be interesting to learn where it comes from. But This might actually be a good idea. If somebody is more sensitive or more delicate, then maybe there should be a different rule. If you really need to wash to be comfortable, it seems consistent with things, even like the passage that Sarah read about live by them, don't die by them, and don't, be unwell because you really just need to do this washing. But on the other hand, it's another example of Rabban Gamliel saying, something, that's your rule, but for me, I'm special, I'm important, and I'm rich, and I'm sensitive and delicate, and I'm extremely religious. So now we're going back to the topic of 2.5. We'll come back to it in 2.8. Chatan im ratzah likrot kriyat Shema laila harishon koreh. If the bridegroom wants to read the Shema the first night, he can. Okay, so this answers the question of what does it mean to be exempt? He's not forbidden from doing so. He's permitted to doing so, according to the anonymous voice here. Now, we've seen this again and again. There are opposing opinions. So one opinion is that he's permitted to, the bridegroom, and the other view is no, he cannot. And Rabban Gamliel, remember, he taught the students, you taught us that the bridegroom should not say the Shema. Remember, they're surprised because they see he's reciting the Shema, and they say, it's the first night, Rabbi, what are you doing? And he says, well, that's your rule, this is my rule. And down here, somebody's saying, if he wants to say the Shema, it's okay. But we already know that Rabban Gamliel doesn't agree with that. And so here's the son of Rabban Gamliel, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. And notice they don't call him rabbi, they call him Rabban, and that's the title because of this exalted hereditary position. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, he's one of these sons who used to like to party before he ascended to the important position. Lo kol harotzeh litol et Hashem litol. Not everyone who wants to do this can do it. So again, he's saying, what, you think you're like my dad? You're not like my dad. You shouldn't be saying this. Maybe I or my father, who are the great rabbis, can keep two things in our minds at once. We can focus on our bride, and we can focus on the Shema, but not the hoi polloi. So usually when there's an anonymous voice and a voice with a name attached to it, the anonymous voice wins. And here the rule goes with the anonymous voice. And you may, but you're not required to say the Shema the first night after getting married. It actually reminds me of a joke, which so it's Yom Kippur in the synagogue, and they're getting to the part where everybody is, bowing down and throwing themselves on the ground and bowing all the way down with their talit over their heads. And the senior rabbi steps forward and says, Master of the universe, I've sinned. I'm worthless. Forgive me. Pardon me. And he's beating himself on the chest. And then the cantor falls down on the stage and does the same thing. Oh, Lord of hosts and heavenly one above, I'm so worthless. I'm evil. I've sinned. Forgive me, forgive me. And then Joe Schmo, the beggar who just lounges around on the street corners, comes up and does the same thing. I am worthless. I'm sinful. And the rabbi says again, look who thinks he's worthless and sinful. Who does he think he is? He's as worthless and sinful as we are? What are you talking about? So now somebody remind me, we didn't go through this story last week, did we, about Rabban Gamliel? Because it was in last week's source sheet, but I honestly am not remembering whether we went through this. Sarah, no? We didn't go through it. Okay, so I'll read through this. And so this is basically to try to take Rabban Gamliel down a couple of pegs. He's so hoity-toity and he's so much better than everyone else, and he's going to actually meet his comeuppance because he goes a little bit too far in this direction. And this is from the Talmud, from the Gemara of Brachot, so it actually goes with this, with these Mishnas. The sages taught. Now, a little detour. Whenever it says the sages taught in the Gemara, they're talking about a teaching that is from the same time period as the Mishnah, but it didn't make the cut. So the Mishnah was edited by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi in the year 200 CE, more or less, plus or minus. And there were a lot of teachings before that time, and Rabbi Yehuda made some editing choices about what was included and what was not. But we still have records of all of these sayings from that same time period that were not included, and they come back to us here in the Talmud. So here's one of them. One time a student came before Rabbi Yehoshua and said, is the evening Amidah optional or required? Now, why might it be optional? Remember that these prayers were set up, a lot of them, to replace what was going on in the temple beforehand. And in the temple, there was a morning sacrifice and an afternoon sacrifice, but there was no nighttime sacrifice. So nowadays, everyone would agree that the morning, the afternoon, and the evening Amidah are all required, but the morning and afternoon are considered to be requirements that come right out of the Bible because they substitute for those sacrifices, whereas the evening is a requirement that comes from the rabbis, because the rabbis also instituted rules. And looks like in this period, there's a dispute. They're not really sure. We know that people are supposed to say it, but we don't know whether it's mandatory or optional. Rabbi Yehoshua says it's optional. The student went to Rabban Gamliel and said, is it optional or mandatory? He said, it's required. Rabban Gamliel is the hard ass. And the student says, but Rabbi Yehoshua told me it's optional. Rabban Gamliel says, we'll see about that. When all of the sages came into the study house, the student stood up and said, is the evening Amidah optional or required? This is a little chutzpahdik. Rabban Gamliel said, it's required. And he says, does anyone disagree with me? What about you, Rabbi Yehoshua? Do you disagree with this? And he says, no. And the student says, but you just told me earlier this afternoon that it's optional. So Rabbi Yehoshua has to admit it. Rabban Gamliel says, Yehoshua, stand up and let the facts testify against you. He's being very disrespectful. He's not even calling him rabbi. And Yehoshua responds, if I were alive and the student were dead, I could contradict him, but we're both alive. I can't lie. I did disagree with you on this point. It's not nice to disagree with the powerful leader here. Rabban Gamliel sits and begins teaching. Rabbi Yehoshua is forced to remain standing there in front of the big dais where Rabban Gamliel is teaching. And by the way, this is one of several stories where Rabban Gamliel does exactly this kind of thing to Rabbi Yehoshua. Several different tales where same conduct. And eventually everyone starts shouting, how long do we have to put up with this? How long is Rabban Gamliel to go on insulting Rabbi Yehoshua? Let us depose him. And they did. And even though he was the hereditary leader, they kicked him out. Although it's said that he stayed in the study house because he wanted to keep praying and he wanted to keep studying, even though he had been deposed. And at that moment, they opened up the doorkeeper, they got rid of the SAT and the entrance exams and all the rest of it and said, do you want to come and study? Come and study. And Rabban Gamliel says, oh my gosh, maybe I've done a terrible thing to keep those students out who wanted to study because I thought they weren't worthy enough. But then I didn't include this in this translation. He has a dream and he's shown barrels of, inside the barrels are white ashes. And he says, oh yeah, they look like nice barrels on the outside, but in the inside they're ashes. So he reassures himself that he did do the right thing to keep these worthless students out. He doesn't remove himself, which is consistent with saying the Shema even the first night of his wedding, right? And eventually he realizes that he owes Rabbi Yehoshua an apology. He journeys to Rabbi Yehoshua's house. When he arrived, he saw that the walls were coal black. He said, oh, from the walls of your house, it's apparent that you were a charcoal burner, which may mean like a very low level position. Somebody who goes into the woods and gathers peat and turns it into charcoal. It's one of the lowest positions. And in those days, being a rabbi was not a paid job. So these rabbis have to make a living, you know, maybe not Rabban Gamliel because he's very rich, but all the other ones, Rabbi Akiva is a shepherd and a lot of other professions. Rabbi Yehoshua said, woe to the generation whose leader you are, and woe to the ship whose pilot you are, for you know nothing of the troubles of the scholars, how they make their living and how they sustain themselves. He's not a very considered person, and he doesn't go out of his way to visit people or to find out their troubles. And Rabban Gamliel says, in all humility, I ask you to forgive me. Rabbi Yehoshua was unmoved. Do it out of respect for my father. And at this, Rabbi Yehoshua made his peace with Rabban Gamliel. I'm going to stop and see if you have any thoughts or reactions to this little tale here. Yeah, I think this is one of these basic stories that says it doesn't matter. You may be especially sensitive, and you may be the smartest person in the room and the richest and most powerful person in the room, but if you don't pay attention to things like your colleagues' poverty and how they make their living and how difficult their lives are, you haven't really done what you needed to do. So I think this is kind of an interesting and valuable story. So I have some really good stuff from the Talmud here, but I'm going to skip part of it. I'll give you this Mishnah, and then I'll skip to the back, and we'll get back to the rest of it if we have time next week. So this is kind of about keva and kind of about kavanah. So I'd like to get your reactions to this. One who reads the Megillah, this is from, by the way, it's Purim today, right? And here's a little source from the Megillah, so happy Purim. Hakore et ha-Megillah lemafreya lo yatsa. If he reads it out of order, he hasn't fulfilled the obligation. If he reads it by heart, you're supposed to read it from a scroll. So if you read it by heart, if you memorize it, that's not okay. If you read it in a translation or some language other than Hebrew, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. This is assuming that you know Hebrew and you could have read it in Hebrew and you just chose not to. You haven't done the minimum that you're required to do. Aval korinota loazot bela'az. If you read it to non-Hebrew speakers in whatever their language is, la'az, let's say they speak Greek. So if you read it to Greek-speaking Jews who don't know Hebrew in Greek, that's okay. And the lo'ez, the Greek speaker, let's say, who heard it in Hebrew, has fulfilled the obligation, even if he didn't understand Hebrew. Okay, so what the heck? All right, it's okay to read it to them in Greek, fine. But if you read it to them in Hebrew, they've satisfied their obligation, even if they didn't understand one word. And who doesn't know people who go to synagogue and are reading in Hebrew, and they might even be able to say one syllable after the other syllable, but they have no idea what they're reading, okay? This is not exactly an unfamiliar phenomenon. So that's okay, they fulfill their obligation, but why? Isn't there supposed to be some degree of kavanah going on? And if you don't understand what you're saying, how can there be any kavanah? And to come back to what we've been talking about, the same rule applies to Hallel, to reciting the Shema, and to the Amidah. So with all of those things, if you read them out of order, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. But there's also this question, we'll dig into the details because we're out of time. Is it okay to say the Shema, or even more so the Amidah, which requires focus and dedication and thinking about what you're saying in the Hebrew language if you don't know what you're saying? And before we get into the source, I want to just open the floor and see if people have thoughts about that. Yeah, please.
So I guess you were just past. So I wonder what the source of this is. There's a web, Judaism 101, that does reference probably the Talmud somewhere, saying that it's okay to read anything in let's see, what is it again? It's okay to read from the Torah, I suppose, in any language as long as you understand it.
Yeah.
This is not consistent with that, so I am curious as to the source. I am.
Yeah, well, this is a source. This is from the Mishnah Megillah, and actually I'm glad you raised it because next week we're going to get into exactly that question, which is, well, wait a second, you're supposed to say the Shema because the same rule applies to the Shema, so it's not okay to say it in translation, but it is okay to read the Torah in translation, and yet the Shema is part of the Torah. But they learned earlier that if you're reading the Torah and you just happen to be reading the section of the Shema and you're not thinking about it as saying the Shema, then that you haven't really said the Shema that way. So there is a difference between just reading the Torah and saying the words versus saying the Shema as a prayer, as part of your spiritual practice, I guess you could say. But how can it be a spiritual practice if you don't understand? Here is a real, I think there's a lot of focus on doing it right. You have to read it from the scroll and you have to read it in the right sequence. If you mix up the order, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. But if you have no idea what you're reading, that's okay. Sarah.
So this reminds me of a discussion in Masechet Sota, in which they say that if the wife who's accused of infidelity does not understand Hebrew, it must be read to her in a language that she understands. So the precedent for a non-Hebrew speaker encountering texts, the law, etc., is there.
Great, that's a really good example. Of course, there, and I don't know that text, so I'm so glad you brought it because I better look it up and find out about it. In this Sota ritual, it's like a criminal trial. So if she doesn't understand the charges against her, it doesn't seem like a fair trial. Although it's a trial that doesn't work by saying and responding; it works by this magical thing that you're supposed to do.
It's less a trial and more hocus pocus, because if you're, it always reminds me of sort of the Edward Allan Poe story about the beating heart underneath the telltale heart, right? So it relies on the woman understanding what she's accused of and knowing her guilt and letting that manifest itself in her body. And so, of course, if she doesn't understand, then there's no way it can manifest itself.
Right. That's that's really interesting comparison. Well, so I'll invite you to go back to that chat and download this. Yeah, Jerry, please.
Well, just about the Megillah, it makes perfect sense in the Megillah that you have to read it in the right order, because it's a story. If you read it in the wrong order, this whole story doesn't make any sense. So from the Megillah, I can understand the order is very important.
Yeah, but finish the thought. You don't think it matters as much with the Shema or the Amidah?
No, I mean, in the Amidah, you have, 18, 19, or actually less on Shabbos, so what's the difference if you say, to me, I don't see why it should matter, but that's just, I'm not educated, so.
Yeah, young man, it matters. And actually, this section of Megillah, here's another example. You think all this discussion of prayers and the Amidah and the Shema would all be in Berachot, because Berachot is about these blessings, and that's the topic of it. But Megillah, it's a little off topic because it's about reading the Megillah, but nonetheless, it's the same rules. So the Talmud is going to go off and spend pages and pages and pages about how you're supposed to say the Shema and the Amidah and why you do it that way. And that's the way it is. It's very, there's a lot of stream of consciousness that goes on and jumping from topic to topic, and part of what makes it fun and interesting to study. So we're out of time. So thank you all, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.